My name is Peter Young. I am president of Societe de Chimie Industriale, who is the host of this event. I'm also president of Young & Partners, one of the leading chemical and life science investment banks. We want to welcome you to this webcast. Because of the coronavirus situation, both Kevin and I are broadcasting from our homes. So you see a different background than you might see if Kevin was broadcasting from his office. Just briefly before we get started, most of you know Societe quite well, but it is a 101-year-old organization that was formed originally as a couple years after the European version got started, and it has a mission to do a number of things. One is to help the chemical industry broader community in terms of understanding important issues, to provide scholarships, to encourage people studying at the graduate, undergraduate level, chemical engineering or biotech or chemistry, and help them do research, but also help them succeed and enter into the industry. And we have mentor programs and a whole variety of things. And we have our International Palladium Medal Award dinner to honor someone who's really contributed towards the well-being of the industry. I am on the board. I'm in the board for 20-something years, currently president, and very proud of the kinds of things that Societe does. I encourage those of you who are not members to join up. There are a number of privileges, one of which for the luncheons, there's special prices, but also you have access to a whole variety of things that otherwise you wouldn't have. The attendees to meetings, slides of the presenters, etc., that are quite valuable. So I encourage you to join and certainly to attend our events. I do want to say that the next event we have is featuring the director of the patent office, and that's going to be May 20th, and that's going to be a very good webcast. We've switched to a webcast for that for the obvious reasons, but that's going to be a very good session because the whole patent intellectual property issues have really changed dramatically and have a direct impact on the chemical and pharmaceutical industries. So with regard to this webcast, I just want to tell you how it's structured. We are a panel. Kevin and I are a panel, and so we are going to walk through and have a discussion of about 5 questions. The first one being, what's the current state of the medical and economic situation? 2, how is it affecting the business and financial health of the chemical industry? 3, what measures have chemical companies taken to deal with the current crisis? 4, what are the likely future financial and economic scenarios that we might face? And then, depending upon how these different scenarios play out, what will be the impact on chemical industry demand, earnings, cash flows, and financial situation? So these are very important topics. Kevin obviously is a leading economist, and probably the leading economist covering the chemical industry, and is the chief economist at the American Chemistry Council. I can't think of anyone better to address these questions than Kevin. And so he will, in fact, obviously have more opinions about the chemical industry and the economic situation. Since I had an investment bank that focused on chemicals and life sciences, I also have views about what the chemical business side is, but also will be able to contribute comments about the financial impact and the balance sheet and financing impact that it's going to have on the chemical industry. Also, because we cover life sciences, we have many experts at my firm who really know this issue about the coronavirus and the drug industry and solutions and vaccines. So we will start off, and I'll give you our thoughts about what the situation is and what makes this virus different from the previous SARS, Ebola, etc. I will not go through a full introduction because I assume all of you have read Kevin's bio and my bio from the invitation. but I also want to welcome all of you. The last thing I want to say before we get started is we're going to spend probably the first 30 minutes having a discussion through these 5 questions. We also have a few slides. Both Kevin and I have a few slides that we think will be helpful to you. But we're also going to make sure that there is plenty of time at the end for Q&A. And the way you answer, you ask a question, there are 2 ways. One is you can use the chat function. And I think everyone's familiar with chat. And just type in your questions, and Kevin and I will be able to see them. And the other is through the Q&A function, which is slightly different, but you can use that, and you can ask questions. And we'll try to go through as many as we can. I think Kevin graciously has said that his slides will be available to our members, and we'll make that available to members on the Societe website, which includes more slides than what we're going to go through today. So with that, let's get started. And I think the first question is, what's the current state of the medical and economic situation? I think Kevin and I agreed that I would first start and just talk on the scientific side, and then turn it over to him to talk about the economic side of the current equation. This is a very unusual situation, and that's why the scientific side, because the coronavirus is very different from previous viruses, it's very important to talk about what that means. Because if you don't understand that, then what the likely scenarios are will be a mystery to you, because this virus has many different characteristics than the previous Ebola or SARS and so forth. Let me walk through them. First of all, this virus has the following characteristics that are different. Number one, you can transmit the disease to someone before you have any symptoms. Now, this is a huge factor. And why? Because SARS, you couldn't infect someone else until you started to have symptoms. And so you knew you were sick, and then hopefully you were responsible and made sure that you didn't infect other people. This one is deadly in the sense that you could have no symptoms at all and yet be infectious. The other is it has some characteristics that are also different that are negative. The SARS virus, if it was on the surface, say on a restaurant counter, it may live for a certain period of time, a couple of hours, but then it dies, or unless someone bleaches the counter or cleans the counter. In the case of the coronavirus, it can remain active for days, which again is a real problem. Say if you go and have a hamburger at a restaurant, you sit down at a counter where someone sat there 2 days before who had the coronavirus. You don't know it, but you are potentially infected. The other side is the issue of how you cure. And this is also a problem because, number one, it does appear that they're starting to see signs that even if someone had the virus but then was cured and then tested negative, many of them are starting to test positive again. Now, why is that a problem? It's very obvious. If you thought you survived and you're tested negative, previous viruses, you won't infect someone else. But in this case, it appears there's some chance that it can resurge after someone has supposedly tested negative. Now, it could be a testing problem, but actually could be a characteristic of the virus. The other is it's not clear whether the antibodies, once you have the antibodies, because your body has fended off the virus, and the antibodies essentially is also how vaccines work, right? Which is, but if you, but the problem here is they've done some testing. It's not clear whether the antibodies are necessarily effective. And of course, that ties into my other comment about the fact that people are testing positive after they've tested negative. And last, in terms of trying to get a cure, there are really only 2 ways. You either have a drug that cures by interfering with the virus's ability to replicate or infect a cell, so forth, or you develop a vaccine that essentially causes the body to create its own defenses. The bad news about a vaccine is it takes 12 to 18 months to develop one. So it may help 12 to 18 months from now in terms of people who haven't had it or have had it and they don't want to get it again. But it doesn't cure the problem now. And the other is through drugs. And the two categories. One is a new drug. And the problem with a new drug is it still has to go through FDA approval and safety and efficacy tests. And that can take, even in an expedited manner, can take quite a long time. So what's left is drugs that were designed for another kind of virus with the hope that it will cure this virus coincidentally. And they're testing all sorts of drugs, antiviral drugs, for ones that were effective for Ebola, so forth. Thus far, the tests have not shown that they're effective against the current virus. So you look at that picture and it's not a pretty picture, right? Because it's not a pretty picture in terms of the ability to infect other people. It's much easier to do so. And it's not a pretty picture in terms of how you solve the problem, because you can only solve it by finding something that kills the virus or prevents it from replicating, or a vaccine. And I think right now, unless they figure out that somehow antibodies in an existing person who has recovered could be effective if used for another patient, or that an existing drug that's already proven to be safe is effective against coronavirus, you're not going to get anywhere along those lines. I felt that was very important because that has a direct impact on the question of how severe is this and why is it spread so rapidly, right, compared to Ebola and the previous SARS. But the other is how quickly and under what circumstances could the scientific and medical profession find a near-term cure or a longer-term preventive. So with that, let me, I wish I had better news, but that is the science. So let me turn it over to Kevin, who will talk about what's the current economic impact of all of this.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Hello, everybody. After that, I guess it can no longer say that economics is the dismal science, but it still is. We are seeing history in the making. And it's just unprecedented, the speed of change which these developments are occurring. I remember I've been a professional economist since the late 1970s. I was in grad school during the recession of the mid-1970s. And things that took place over months and even quarters are now occurring daily and within weeks. And it's just unprecedented, the speed of change these things are occurring. It's sort of like catching a falling knife, or trying to. And what we have essentially is worldwide, it's lockdowns of the economies, various economies, because of health reasons. And Peter, I don't know if we wanted to introduce the slides that I have at this particular point.
Shall I pull up your slide?
Sure. Yeah.
And actually, I forgot, but here's one slide I just want to show. Just saying, the good news is it looks like the deaths per day are flattening out. That's the good news. The bad news is the numbers are still quite high. So that was a chart I wanted to show. But here's your first chart, Kevin.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. We developed about close to 10 years ago, something we call the CAB, leading economic indicator. It's a leading indicator for the U.S. business cycle, turns in it, the peaks, troughs, the end of an expansion, the end of a recession, so on and so forth. And, it declined in February. It's been actually weak for about the past year. The data are based on signals emanating from the chemical industry and other materials, early supply chain industries. And we had its largest decline since prior to the 1921 recession, the steepest decline in any given month, down 8% in March. Now that was provisional. It may change one way or the other, but it follows a decline in February and generally weak activity over the the prior year, which was signaling a slowdown at that particular point. We're going to release it next Tuesday. This year we've pushed it back a week just so we can have better information, and the revisions are less. But I took a stab at looking at the data thus far, and it's likely that in April the CAB will be off about 10%, maybe even more. So let's go to the next slide, Peter. And this just shows some of the regional Federal Reserve manufacturing surveys. They tend to come out mid-month for that month, so you get sort of an early read. And we've had Philadelphia and New York report thus far. They've had record declines. It's just a great way, these indicators of the manufacturing sector, which we sell about 85% of the output of basic and specialty chemicals to other manufacturing sectors. So this is our customer base. And what these surveys are showing, that it's rapidly declining, unprecedented. Both surveys thus far for April, record declines. And we'll be picking up the Kansas City figures, I think tomorrow, Texas and Richmond early next week, sort of an early read. Now, the lockdowns primarily have affected the services sectors. Retail, hospitality, leisure, travel, things such as that, but ultimately the ripple effects come back to manufacturing and to the chemical industry. So with that in mind, the economic environment that we have is declining rapidly. I found with interest was almost sort of not a contest, but to see the economists or the economics teams at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan trying to say who would have the largest decline in second quarter GDP, but some of the things that maybe people thought were, gee, that's extreme, it's pretty mainstream right now. We will have a large decline this quarter. So.
Yeah. Let me comment a little bit too. So, obviously, Kevin, obviously there's been a huge drop in economic activity on a global basis. And the interesting thing is it affects different industries differently. As you mentioned, the ones that are most severe, the ones that are in entertainment and travel and restaurants, where people have to be close to each other in order for that service. And for them, many of them, they're down to zero revenues because they just can't operate. On the other extreme, there are some industries, a few industries that are doing well, a small number, and the people who create toilet paper are cranking out like crazy, right? But it all depends upon what industry, how severe it is. But everyone is having difficulty. It's just a measure of how much, right? But also, there's also a financial impact, because with a lot of people in distress, they're having trouble paying rents. Retail establishments having trouble paying rents, or businesses having trouble paying rents, consumers who've lost their job having rents. So you're having a financial impact as well, as that's backing up into the system, because obviously the people who are landlords, et cetera, they have debt payments they have to make and so forth. So the financial system is also really tied in. The last comment I'd like to make is about the fiscal efforts by Congress, Senate, and governments, but also the central banks. And you saw an unprecedented move on the part of the Fed in the US, and they pulled out all the stops in terms of both interest rates, purchasing of bonds, et cetera. I mean, they've even gone so far as to supporting purchases of high yield bonds which they never did, right? So they pulled out all the stops. And of course, we all know about all of these stimulus and payment programs that are being done around the world. The problem is that the problem is so huge that it's just the amount of money and the number of techniques you have to do to keep it from going down is very limited. You know, the typical business, small to medium-sized business in the U.S., probably only has cash to go for a month without revenues, and this is clearly not a 1 month problem. I think the last thing I say, and this is what makes difficult, is the central banks and so forth. They used a lot of the weapons to recover from the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, lowering interest rates, creating liquidity, etc. So although they're making as big a move as they can, the fact of the matter is the number of tools they have is more limited, particularly if you talk about countries outside the U.S. and developing countries. Right? The U.S. is blessed because the dollar is the, is the international currency, et cetera, and we have more financial reserves. But many countries really don't have any weapons that they can use because they just don't have the financial resources. So that's kind of the picture of the, our first question, which was, what's the current state of the medical and economic situation? So let's turn, Kevin, to the second question, which is, what's the impact? How is it affecting the business and financial health, specifically of the chemical industry? And I just want to show two charts that are a little depressing, and that's on the financial side. And this is, the Young Partners, we have 7 chemical industry indices in the West, and here are the ones for the US. And you can see that not only did the overall stock market come down significantly, but the chemical industry indices went down even more severely, in the order of magnitude of 30-something%. So there's been a major hit to the stock prices of chemical companies. It's a little bit better in Europe, and particularly one group, the European specialties, haven't been hit as much in the basic chemicals, but it's still a very, very difficult period. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you for a while to talk about the issue of the impact on the chemical industry of the current crisis.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Yeah, starting at the start of the year, after 18 months of a trade war and some activity, downstream activity, inventory building and destocking, a soft manufacturing sector, we're fairly optimistic that this will be the mirror image of 2019 and things would grow. And we provided a situation outlook, our year-end typical situation outlook last year, and we're fairly optimistic, growth in US GDP. Well, that's all changed. What's interesting is I keep looking at the data. ACC collects plastic resins production and captive use data on the major resins. And I get a preliminary look at some of the results. And I kept waiting for March to drop off. And actually, the March figures held up fairly well, up roughly about 7% compared to a year ago. And we are starting, some of the real-time data that we do look at are soft. We like to look at rail car loadings. Those have been soft in some of the recent weeks. And so it's starting to have an impact on the industry. But there are some bright spots. Keep in mind, I mentioned manufacturing before. 96% of all manufactured goods are directly touched by chemistry. If you include the indirect touch, it's 100%. But if you look at some of the areas that have been doing well within chemicals, keep in mind that about 3/4 of our companies supply the raw materials that go into a lot of these PPE products. So for example, we supply the raw materials, the intermediate chemicals that go into biocides, antibacterial soap, hand sanitizers, antimicrobial disinfectants, detergents, so on and so forth, bleaches, things such as that. Certain resins, polypropylene, for example, certain grades of polypropylene are doing quite well because those go into the nonwovens for the, the medical garments and this things such as that, masks. So there are, some areas that are doing quite well, but, in turn, we tend to follow or actually lead the overall manufacturing sector. And we are starting to see some easing of activity outside some of these few bright spots.
Yeah, and in reality is those are relatively, it's good news for those people who are in that,
Yeah.
but it's a relatively small part of the chemical industry, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. But there are some bright areas. How's its impact? It's starting to impact volumes as measured by rail car loadings, things going out the plant gate. Companies are, some of them do have the flexibility, and I'm really proud of our member companies that have stepped up to manufacture products that were downstream to them that otherwise they wouldn't normally be manufacturing. They're pivoting operations to capacity to produce, hand sanitizers, things like that. There's a site on the ACC website that highlights some of these. I just wanted to point those out. Companies are facing, some operational challenges, obstacles. Many of this, dealing with maybe various state governments are not consistent. In logistical areas, port closures, things such as that. Some of the social distancing has, impacts on that. So,
but when you really look at the big picture, it really depends upon what part of the chemical industry you're in. I think, first of all, depending upon your supply chain situation, but also the markets you serve, how severe this coronavirus has on your business is very different. So, for example, if you are serving the oil industry, oil field services and chemicals, it's a disaster because of the disaster in oil prices, and oil has been affected even greater than the general economy. Also, if you were serving the automotive industry was already having difficulty before all this happened, and now it's even more severe. So if you were providing nylon for using cars or paint, so forth, clearly that has had a severe impact. So, but it all depends upon on the revenue side. It all depends upon what markets you're serving. There are others like water treatment, et cetera, that aren't being affected at all because the economic situation doesn't affect the customer needs. On the supply side, however, it's been a real problem because now this world is so interconnected, and for so many industries, they're getting their raw materials from other parts of the world. And so depending upon where they're making their product or where they're sourcing raw materials, there have been some serious disruptions. A good example is a huge percentage of the active ingredients for pharmaceuticals are made in China and India. And if you're Pfizer or if you're someone making pharmaceutical intermediates, it's a big problem if you can't get product from China or India. The other side, of course, is the financial side. And there, depending who you are, how much debt you had, et cetera, there have been very, very different scenarios. Some people are lucky and their maturities are way out in terms of when they have to repay the debt, but they still have to make debt payments. So I think if you look across, I would say there have been numerous both business and financial impacts, not to mention how do you run a business if no one can be more than 6 feet, it have to be at least 6 feet apart, and that's affected a lot of people in terms of being able to run their business. So let's move. The natural thing is to move to the next question, which is what measures have chemical companies taken in reaction to this crisis, right? So depending who they are, they're affected differently. But what are the kinds of things that the chemical industry as a group, what have they been doing to try to deal with this crisis? Kevin?
Well, as I mentioned, we're facing some operational issues, transportation, distribution issues, port closures, driver availability, service, things such as that. Reduced available workforce. If somebody's sick or you have to quarantine. As everybody else, we face the reduced availability of personal protective products, the PPE. There's operational issues related to, the various state and localities, their mandates, executive orders and as such. Containers, packaging availability, and other issues, reduced operations hours, capacity. These are all challenges. Companies are finding challenges procuring or taking delivery of raw materials or other products. One of the things I've seen, and this is pretty much public information. You just look at the trade news feeds, and a number of companies have cut back on their capital spending programs, for example. Peter, I have a little sign outside my, as I walk out the door of my office, and it says something to the effect that assets are contingent, debt is forever.
Yeah.
And it kind of alludes to what you were talking with before. If you have debt against certain assets, the debt never changes. The value of that asset can. So I think what we're seeing is a recession, very deep.
Yeah, but we're talking about what chemical companies are doing.
But
yeah, and I would say certainly on this financial side, I think the first thing that the first big problem is if you can't predict, it's hard to decide on an emergency plan. And that's the number one problem that clients of ours have said, trying to plan around a different scenario. Well, what scenario do you pick? So that's the first thing. The second, though, is all the companies have taken a look at their liquidity situation, because you could have the best strategy, the best products, and so forth, and raw materials, but if you run out of cash, you're out of business. So the number one thing that every single CFO of every company, private or public, has done is to look at their cash flow and look at how much cash they had, look at the debt maturities, and try to create as much liquidity as they can. People have drawn down their credit lines as the max so that they have the cash on hand. And wherever they can actually raise money, they've tried to raise money. So they're really looking at the liquidity issue, right? The other is that they've all examined their supply chains and tried to figure out how to make sure they have the raw materials if different countries are shut down, how they can make sure they have the raw materials to operate their plants. And the other, of course, is depending on what kind of plant you have, you either have a serious problem or you don't have a problem, right? I mean, if you're running a big petrochemical plant with very few people, that's one thing. But if you're running a plant that has lots of people and so forth, it's another problem. And I think the other is just people have trying to figure out how to reduce their costs and their outflow of cash, and how to match it with revenues, which of course they're having difficulty predicting. So people, where they think it makes sense, they're furloughing people and laying them off. But they're really having to go through all of those things. And the problem with this is usually you only have to deal with one or two problems. In this case, you have so many different variables that you have to deal with, and your ability to forecast is very limited. So it's been a very challenging time for chemical industry executives.
Right. Yeah, as I was getting to, that this recession is going to be unique in that it's almost like a cash flow recession, economy-wide. I mean, from your local pizza shop to, your large multinational. It's companies organizations are racing to preserve cash.
Yeah. That comes to our next question, which is trying to predict the future, which of course is it's a challenge. And Kevin, you and I chatted about this because neither one of us is bashful about trying to do a forecast, but this one is really a tough one. I know you've got a couple of slides that you have. Do you want to go through those?
Yeah, let's go through those, Peter. Yeah, thank you. Let's cue them up, and then we'll.
Okay. All right. Here we go.
Yes, that's fine. This that slide just shows we kind of ran two scenarios. One which is just more or less a consensus forecast, and this is what this reflects. It's just sort of the overall global macroeconomic environment. And just a couple of key indicators, world GDP, world trade, which is the most pronounced effect is being occurring there, and in world industrial production, the sectors we sort of sell into. It's a simultaneous downturn all over the world, starting in China and East Asia. It's spread to Europe, and the consensus seems to be that global GDP will contract on the order of about 2.5% to 3%, as most of the estimates, from the IMF, the OECD, the macro forecasters that do that. World trade, which was reeling from the trade wars of the prior 2 years, is really going to be have a most pronounced hit this year. So when we were talking about forecasting before, it's just difficult to make a single point forecast. So what we've done is we've looked at, okay, here's the consensus, and then what could go wrong? What if we're wrong? How could that emerge or develop? So we ran another scenario where we looked at a more, instead of a V-shaped recovery, one that's more U or L-shaped. It's a longer downturn lasting maybe into the fourth quarter. And so let's go to the next slide, Peter. Okay. And this is again, sorry, this is not the scenario. This is just sort of the core consensus outlook. Just some key things. We talked about uncertainty before, and how do you plan and manage a company, and that's most manifested in business investment, and that's really going to fall this year. We've seen announcements by large companies are cutting back on their capital spending programs, 10, 15, 20%. I've seen upstream in the exploration and production, reductions in spending by some people who follow this of close to 90% in some areas. So that's where this will be most pronounced, is in people cannot leave their homes. They're not going to spend on automobiles, going to the movie theater, dining out, things such as that, going to the dry cleaner, a haircut. I'm in desperate need of a haircut.
Me too, Kevin.
Yeah. And I'm awfully afraid my wife's going to ask me to do something with her hair. So, get recruited. So let's go to the next slide, Peter. Are we ready? Want to talk about that and some of the scenarios?
Yeah, well, why don't you go through this? I'll also go through, you and I have a little bit different scenarios, but why don't you start with yours, and then I'll walk through the scenarios that I had said, but go ahead.
Okay, let's just look at 2020, what's going on this year. And what we did is we looked at what we were saying back in December of 2019 in our year-end situation outlook. GDP would grow by a below trend 1.8%, driven by consumer spending, less so by business investment, but that was still going to grow. So is industrial production. So what we did is we've laid out recently sort of a baseline which reflects the consensus forecast, and then we looked at something that was just a little bit was more pessimistic, that this pandemic would maybe last longer. There might be a second wave, that the economy would essentially be in lockdown and not begin to unlock until much later in the year. And looking at the U.S. GDP, instead of falling, say, 4%, may fall 6% as it's more prolonged. Our bounce back that we would see typically in a recovery. And so that would translate into much lower consumer spending, business investment, going globally, in industrial production as well, but going globally, a much deeper downturn in world trade, a much deeper downturn in world GDP this year. Let's go to what this means for chemicals. I think that's the next slide.
Yep, here we go.
Okay, this is just sort of the macro. This is just some of the figures, and we'll make these slides available. We just looked at the baseline, and again, the pessimists, some of the numbers that go with that, with each of the different scenarios. And light vehicle sales, for example, are going to be way off this year, but they could be off even more, with only a very slow recovery next year, and the year after that maybe getting towards normal. The same with housing and some of the other measures that we look at. I'm not going to dwell on this too much. Peter, let's go to the next one.
I don't think we have another one.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have another one.
Okay, fine. That's it, pretty much. So,
but I think, but that's based on, I guess it's sort of your baseline of, and then a pessimistic, which is, but not either Armageddon or optimistic. Right. It's sort of, in the middle part, right?
Yeah. I thought we had a slide on chemicals, but I can talk about that, and I'm going to only talk about essentially three things, a couple things that, chemicals excluding pharmaceuticals, which is the way we look at it, basics and specialties. And, we are expecting, the output of chemicals excluding pharmaceuticals back in December to grow about 0.5 percentage point this year. We're now expecting, 3.25% decline. If it gets pessimistic, 6.5% decline this year for basics. It's relative, of course, a little bit better, but only falling roughly 3% in the baseline, maybe 6.75% decline. If things were more pessimistic, more pronounced, more difficult, the recovery. Specialties falling in the baseline about 4.5%, over 6% in the pessimistic scenario. But then when you get to the revenue shipments down 10% this year, it could be down close to 20% if the more pessimistic view turns out. Capital spending, a lot of that's already in progress. It will be slowed, but it could fall in a more pessimistic scenario for this year alone. And again, keep in mind we're 1 quarter into it. We're in the baseline, maybe falling 2%, but in the more pessimistic scenario, if companies really start to pull back in capital spending, close to a 15% decline in chemical industry capital spending, with a much slower recovery next year.
Now, Kevin
will provide.
Yeah, Kevin and I, sort of took a different approach in looking at scenarios, and we young parties sort of have 3 scenarios. So first of all, of course, there are thousands of scenarios you could paint because there's so much uncertainty, right? But we felt it's useful to at least paint a couple of scenarios and then say, what does that mean? But and we have sort of 3 scenarios that we'd like to talk about. But before I do it, I just want to step back and look at the big picture and say, um, how do we characterize the current situation relative to previous crises? So for example, the 2008 and 2009 crisis did not start as an economic crisis. It was a financial crisis because there was problems in terms of mortgage-backed securities, and that created a big problem on the financials in the financial world, which then spilled over into the economy, right? We have a different situation here. We have a health situation that's caused governments to have to do things that have shut down the economy. And then the next question, though, is what's the spillover into the financial side? Because they are interconnected. And I'll speak to different scenarios in that respect. If we only have an economic downturn, even if it's severe, with a very mild spillover into financial, I think it's one scenario. But if in fact the financial world gets clogged up, and I'll give an example. If people don't pay rent or they don't pay their mortgages, the people who hold the mortgages or the landlords, they've got debt, they've got a service, they've got so forth. So the world is interconnected. And if you have a number of those people suddenly financially failing or in serious condition, now you've got a financial system crisis that's been ignited by an economic crisis. So keep that in mind. And now I'm going to walk through three scenarios which I think are representative of what could happen. I think the most optimistic scenario is that we have a rapid flattening of deaths and new hospitalizations, and that that happens so that you can start the governments and states start to feel comfortable to open up the economy in the midsummer. No one is predicting that you have a economic opening up in May. Then you may start to be less restrictive, but no one is predicting that. So I think best case scenario is where the economy starts to open up because the health situation is good enough for them to justify that. In that scenario, you'll have painful financial system effects, but you'll have no major meltdown in the financial world, and you're going to start to have the major economies, not the emerging markets, but the major Western and Asian economies starting to recover. But you'll have some businesses that will have shut down permanently and can't recover, and you're going to have a lot of bankruptcies. And we do corporate strategy, restructuring, we do financing and M&A, and sadly, some parts of our business actually will do better because there's a need for restructuring. So that's scenario number one, and that means you start to see some recovery in the fall, and that's probably in line, I guess, Kevin, with one of your scenarios, right?
Right. Yeah.
Scenario number two, which is really quite possible. So the first scenario is possible. The second scenario is that because of the health situation, there's just a very much longer period before they can start to open up the major economies. And if that's the case, and they have to delay because certain states or certain countries open up and suddenly they have another surge in cases, then it may be that around the world, a lot of people then say, okay, I'm going to have to delay opening up the economy. I mean, a good example of what could happen is Singapore. Singapore did a wonderful job of closing down their economy, shutting down international travel into Singapore. It's a fairly controlled country and a small country, so their ability to control the economy and travel is very, very good. And they really clamped down and they thought they could declare victory. But more recently, there's been another big surge in people who are getting the disease, and so now there's some confusion about whether Singapore did enough, or what caused this to happen. So that's one scenario where essentially, in spite of the good efforts, or even maybe spotty efforts on the part of governments and states, that they conclude in the summer that it's still too early and they've got to keep on clamping down. Under that scenario, you got a problem because time is a big enemy for the economy. The longer you shut things down, the more damage and the wider and the more permanent the damage is. So scenario two is you don't start opening up anything until you start to get to the fall. At that point, you're going to have spillover into the financial system, because the prolonged period of people not being able to pay rent or not having incomes is going to be severe. And so you're not going to start any kind of recovery until probably after year end. The third, and unfortunately the most negative scenario, is one that I hope doesn't happen, but there's a real possibility it'll happen. And it's more based on the science more than the efforts of governments, right, and individuals. And that is, if it turns out that in fact the antibodies don't really protect you, none of the drugs that are already approved for other viruses work, and so you got to depend on either new drugs or vaccines that won't appear for another 12 to 18 months. And on top of that, you have a situation that people have, that there's a resurgence of people with the disease. Now you have a really serious problem. And on top of which, if that means you have a resurgence of coronavirus in the winter, at the same time that you have the flu season, you have a very different picture. In which case, the recovery will take an extended period of time, maybe a couple of years, and the point at which you can open up, and it's going to look more like a depression than a severe recession. So those are the three, those are the three scenarios. I'm hoping for the first one, but I also realize that the third one is got a probability that's greater than zero. So with that, by the way, both Kevin and I are optimistic people, so we're not natural pessimists, but we're both realists, right? And we're dealing with companies that can't dream, they've got to have practical solutions, right? So, when all is said and done, Kevin, if you put on your crystal ball and suddenly transported 12 months from now, what do you think the world will look like for the chemical industry?
Well, it's going to be a lot different, like it will be for society and our economy. Things are going to change. I mean, I will probably go into a supermarket a year from now and there'll be somebody wiping down the shopping cart for me. We'll just have to get used to things like that.
They might be wiping you down as well. You never know, right? Well, what I'd like to do now is turn to questions from the audience. And so we have a couple here. And let me, actually someone said, here we go. Here's a question from Howard Howe. He says, what kind of initiatives, if any, do you see emerging within the industry to promote future resiliency, redundancy, and flexibility in sourcing, processing, and outputs? Granted, resiliency and flexibility don't come free. They compete with short-term earnings and shareholders. So what do you think the industry will probably try to do or should do in order to have more resiliency and et cetera to deal with this kind of problem? Kevin, you want to take a shot first?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about, I think, the business sector in general, which would include the chemical industry, but I think companies are now rethinking their supply chains to have some resiliency, some options that they're not dependent on one particular source in one particular country. We may see inventories managed differently, and things such as that. And it's going to take some time. It's going to evolve as companies work things out. So,
yeah, I think the industry is going to have to rethink the whole way they do things. And I think they're going to have to build in a lot more, as you say in your question, flexibility to be able to go zig or zag. It means they're going to try to diversify their supply chain, right? So they're not overly dependent on China or some other country. And they're also going to change the way they operate so that they have flexibility of moving people around and moving production and so forth. But I think you're right. They're all going to sort of say, look, rigid is not good because especially for these black swan events that unfortunately happen more often than you would like, right? I mean, think about it. It's only been 12 years since the last financial crisis. That's
Right.
not a long time, right? This next question is, so we have low oil prices and naphtha and other raw material costs are now down. And is this benefiting the people who are petrochemical producers? Is this a good thing for them?
Well, what we've seen with the collapse of oil prices and then naphtha prices, which are highly correlated with that compared to, say, natural gas and ethane in this country, we've seen the flattening of the cost curve. I mean, it's just remarkable. Most cost curves are, if you were to look at a map of the United States, it would be a line that sort of goes from San Diego to Texas and then starts to go up the East Coast. The cost curve for ethylene right now is essentially it's I-10 across the southern tier of the United States. So that's been flattened. A lot depends on. I mean, we just saw on Monday something I thought I would never in my life see, that I never even contemplated, that the future price for WTI going negative. So
Yeah.
we live in a new world.
My answer to that, to the person about that, is it all depends upon what happens on the other end. So if you have a lower cost of raw materials, but you're competing with other people, your ability to preserve that extra margin really is dependent on what's happening on the other end. If you have the ability to hold your price and widen your margin, and that you're not in a competitive situation that forces you to have to drop your price, you'll do fine. But the problem is that if you have a decline in demand on the other end, everyone's fighting to preserve volume. So your ability to hang on to that extra margin is tough. But it ultimately it depends upon what product you have. It depends upon how much it's a commodity or a specialty. If your customer doesn't have any have any choice to switch to other vendors, you probably hold on to it. So it all depends. But in the end, a lot of it depends upon what happens on the other end, which is when you're looking at your customers and who you're competing with. Kevin, you have a comment?
Yes, and I mean, when we get to the end of this, we will still have some of the lowest cost natural gas in the world. There's continued gains in productivity in that area. And actually, I mean, if you look at the last 2 years, the price has been driven largely down to the marginal cost. But we will still be a low cost producer of that. Just a lot depends on the relationship of oil to gas, those prices and the such. And again, Peter, what you said, what it will look like when we get past this, 2 years out or 3 years out.
There's a question here from Thomas Mahoney, who said, how are producers of pharmaceutical APIs faring in the macroeconomic decline, generally speaking? I'll answer that because we cover the life sciences and we cover everything between chemicals and pharma, which includes APIs and et cetera. And it's kind of a mixed situation. On the positive side, as many of my friends in the drug industry say, in recessions, people take more drugs than less drugs. So that's one part of it, and so drugs are generally not affected. They're more recession-proof. But in this case, you've got a big problem because the shutdowns and problems that occurred where so many of the APIs are being produced in India and China. That's a problem because those producers, in China, there were a lot of shutdowns. In India now, they're still in a shutdown nationally. So if you can't produce, it doesn't help you if there's a lot of demand if you can't produce.
Yeah.
So I think it's a mixed situation. I think for the producers of pharmaceutical APIs in India and China, there's a bit of a bad news because I think some customers are going to say, I can't depend so heavily on China and India. So they're going to try to diversify. Just like Apple is trying very hard to figure out how they can make iPhones in more places than just China. So I think there's that. So it's pluses and minuses, right?
Right.
So with that, I think we try very hard to always start on time and end on time. And we still have a lot of questions. So I apologize for those of you whose questions were not answered. What I will do though is I will pass your questions. Kevin and I will look at your questions and see if somehow we can answer some of those and get to you. But I want to thank Kevin for being a co-panelist with me, and in this nice combination of an investment banker and and an economist, right? It's a dangerous combination, right? And I want to thank all of you who tuned in. I hope you found this to be useful. The whole idea here is for Societe to host events that are directly useful to how all of you do your daily jobs, whatever it may be, whether it's in industry or research or otherwise. And we hope we'll have more of these coming up in the future. So thank you all, and more importantly, we hope you're all safe. And someone did ask again about the slides, and those are going to be available at a minimum to members of Societe, and perhaps more, but want to keep all of you safe. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing you for the next event.